Hello, I'm John Janarone, Editor-in-Chief of CorpGov, here in the sidelines of the Tulane Conference in New Orleans, Louisiana, with Mike Verrechia, who's a Senior Managing Director, and Morrow Sodali. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having us.
So, Mike, I want to jump right into the topic of the universal proxy card. For our viewers who aren't that familiar with it, it's been around, I think we're going into the second year. In particular, it's impacted Disney. I wrote about Disney about a year ago when Nelson Peltz showed up, but things have evolved quite a bit and UPC has become part of it. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very, interesting contest in the sense that it's really the first time we have two different sets of activist investors using their own UPC.
Yeah.
And so we have, for the first time ever, three universal proxy cards.
Yeah.
And that actually creates a lot of choices, right, for shareholders. So historically, you would have just the two competing cards, and firms like ISS and Glass Lewis will make a recommendation on one or the other.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's really, we have three cards and we have basically 12 seats with 17 nominees across three slates of directors.
Yeah.
And so I think it forces everyone to think about, making recommendations and ultimately voting in a different way.
Great. I'm curious, how do the proxy advisors look at the UPC? I mean, how does it impact their recommendations?
It's actually a very interesting question because the advisory firms still think about how to make recommendations using the same approach that they did prior to the UPC.
Okay.
So it's still a two-pronged approach for the most part, where the first and ultimate, barrier is, has someone made a case that change is necessary in the boardroom? And if and only if, then we move to the next tier, which is, who are the right nominees to kind of steer the ship going forward. But what's interesting here is that you actually kind of have prong one and then maybe prong 2A and 2B, right? Because now you have two different sets.
Yeah.
If a case for change has been made across the arguments from both sets of dissidents, now you basically are saying, okay, you come to the conclusion that change is necessary. Now you have a pool of basically five nominees across two different slates to figure out who's really best suited to kind of take it forward. And so you could, in that way, you could basically make a recommendation on any card for any subset of directors like you always do. But I think it's just, it really kind of adds a second prong to that, second prong approach.
That makes sense. Now, UPC is all about shareholder democracy, right? I got to tell you, for the average investor who owns, some of them only have one share of Disney. And by the way, there are millions of them who own shares of Disney. Is this stuff confusing for the retail investors? I mean, are they getting stuff in the mail, not knowing what to do with it? Is that part of your job to help them understand what to do?
Yeah, I think it absolutely can be confusing. I think even just a normal proxy can be confusing for an individual shareholder who doesn't really overly focus on those types of things. But it is our job and the job of, the activist or the company to make a clear argument and ask for a clear instruction. I mean, the ask is got to be very clear, the call to action to vote. And so, I think it can be confusing, for individual shareholders when it comes time. But ultimately, I think you said it, and I think you're right. The universal proxy card is really ultimately about shareholder democracy. And so what's interesting about that campaign is that, you have one set of activists who are targeting two nominees on the board, and you have another set of activists who are not targeting anyone. And instead they're saying, here are our nominees that we believe are qualified.
Yeah.
And evaluate them and vote on them on their merit. And I think that's kind of the unique part. I think at P&G, there was a similar situation where the activist was running for one seat and was targeting someone, and halfway through the contest said, look, if we win, we would move to expand the board and add the person back on. Yeah. And I think what you're seeing with the Blackwell's campaign is kind of anchored in a shareholder proposal as well. And so that makes it a little bit unique. But I think at the end of the day, it is about democracy, and it's about, these are nominees that we think are additive or could be constructive to the process in the boardroom. And so you vote on them on your merit, and by the way, like the advisory firms and also the institutions, they have their own voting guidelines and policies and potential reasons for why they might withhold on the existing board. And so, part of it is make the case for change, and then, here are our nominees, and choose the best people going forward. And it's interesting because it really hasn't been done this way, and it'll be interesting to see if others kind of emulate that as we go forward.
Gotcha. Mike, in the last several months, I've asked many advisors like you, your peers, where is UPC going? And I hear it's early days, but is this maybe going to be a precedent? Could this be significant if Blackwell's wins here? And it's, you know what I mean? Because everyone is still saying, well, wait and see, I'm not sure.
I think it's this. I think every contest is a unique approach, and so I think there are certainly contests where you might look at the board and say, hey, there are 2 or 3 nominees that absolutely have to go. Right?
Yeah,
and you might run your campaign that way. But yeah, listen, others may look at it and say, we feel like we have real, qualified candidates that have relevant experience and can take it forward, and we ask that you vote for those people again on that merit. So I don't know that I don't know that we're going to see every contest look like this, but at the same time, it's interesting that it's happening, and I think every contest is unique, and so you have to take a unique approach to what you do in your campaign.
Okay, last question for you, Mike. In the early days, everyone was speculating, is UPC going to turn out to give one side versus another an advantage? Do we have a conclusion on that yet?
That's a good question. I mean, we're a year and a half into UPC, and I don't really think we've seen any campaigns where the UPC, the voting utensil, has given one side a serious advantage over the other to this point. I think at the end of the day, because people still approach the voting decision, whether it's a vote recommendation from advisory firms or it's institutional holders trying to get to a voting decision, because that process hasn't really changed, the universal proxy card, as I said, it's really just a voting, it's a tool at this point. What it does, obviously better than the old 2-card system, is it just allows you to very easily split your vote as opposed to having to do it at the meeting itself. So up to this point, I don't really see much of an advantage one way or the other, management versus the activist. But again, I say every campaign is unique, and there may be situations where, a low level or an entry level activist, uses the UPC or the cost, because you have to mail to 2/3 of the outstanding shares. There may be a way for them to run a cost-effective campaign, get their names, their nominees on the management ballot, and that could be beneficial to them, right? But up to this point, I haven't really seen evidence that says the UPC itself benefits one side or the other. It's really just a voting utensil at this point.
All right. Well, I guess we're just going to have to keep an eye on things and see how it all shakes out. All right, Michael, this has been terrific. Thanks for joining us here. I'm John Janaron, Editor-in-Chief of CorpGov, signing off from New Orleans, Louisiana.